here today came because they must have some sort of interest in the cemeteries or maybe those houses that are on Franklin Avenue. When I first posted about this tour, the first thing that I got was a million people saying it's Franklin Boulevard, not Franklin Avenue. And that's not true, first of all. So, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of history about the area where Franklin Boulevard is before we head out to our first person. So it does depend on the time period that we're talking about as to whether it was Franklin Place, like Franklin Street, Avenue, or where we ended on Boulevard. The area there was surveyed and then donated by Josiah Barber and Richard Lord. The idea was that they wanted something of some sort of a public park or something like that, which is what Franklin Circle originally was mapped out to be a public park, some green space within the city. Across from the circle was erected the Franklin Circle Christian Church. The park then was developed with trees, shrubs, benches. If you go online and look up Franklin Circle Garden or something to that effect, you'll see all kinds of pictures of what it used to look like. It was very pretty. Sometime between 1874 and 1881, Franklin Place became Franklin Street. And then again, it changed shortly after that to become Franklin Avenue. Once all of these things started developing, they put a streetcar right through the center of the park. They did that because they wanted to bring people over there. And it worked. Some of these new homes started to attract new money millionaires, as they call them. In 1907 was when Forest City Railway cut through that park. With the introduction of the automobile, Franklin Circle did see another major change. This time it eliminated the park completely and paved over that circle. Franklin received its final name change between 1912 and 1927. I could not pinpoint that. I was just going based off of historical maps. And it became Franklin Boulevard. Aside from the beautiful homes, Franklin Boulevard was the site for Cleveland's first waterworks system. So if you drive down Franklin Avenue, coming from the circle on your left-hand side, you're going to see community gardens. And before it was community gardens, it was the city reservoir. The reservoir was built with the idea that there needs to be a way to have some sort of water supply brought from the city. Now, when they built this, what they did, and to be honest with you, I think it's a little weird, but I mean, to each their own. But what they did is they built this promenade that came up kind of like a trapezoid sort of shape, and it allowed people to walk up this gravelly path, stand up there, and be able to see all of the views of Cleveland. At the time, it was the tallest, or I guess highest elevation of a man-made structure in the city at that time. And the name Fairview comes from that erection of the trapezoid-shaped promenade. So eventually what happens is they find a more productive waterworks system, and they go ahead and level it all out. It sits vacant for some time. People say, okay, let's make it into a park, and part of it is Fairview Park. The other part of it is what I believe is called Kentucky Gardens or Community Gardens, and that's still what it is used for today. When Maria and I were walking down Franklin Boulevard to do our own little research, we were kind of surprised at how busy it was. And there was a lot of people in there. There was a lot of really nice plants growing. You could see all the different trees producing fruit. So it was really cool. And it's nice to see a big open garden space like that in the middle of the city. So the first stop here is Abraham Teachout. His house is still standing. The address is there. It's 4514 Franklin Boulevard. Okay, so Abraham, he was born in New York. He lost his mother at a very young age. He is one of 7 siblings. However, the 7th did die in infancy due to the death of the mother. Abraham's father took on raising 6 young children and did so in a surprising manner. And I say that because apparently the neighbors were shocked that a man could raise 6 children without a woman. And he did so very well. His father, Abraham's father, was extremely anti-Mason. even taking part in the trial of missing Captain William Morgan. He instilled these anti-Masonic beliefs on his children, and to my knowledge, none of them participated in any sort of secret societies or fraternal relations or anything like that. In 1837, the Teachout family left New York and settled in North Royalton. And just about a year later, Abraham left for Cleveland for work on a canal and eventually captained those canal boats. He formed a partnership with Robert Brayton, foreman of the Cuyahoga Steam Furnace Company, and together they built a steam sawmill. Mr. Teachout was engaged in the temperance movement and insisted that the work be done on this sawmill completely dry. Now, in this time, obviously, you had people that were all the way absolutely no alcohol to the other side where it's like, no, we need it to survive. Well, these workers were those people who thought that they actually needed whiskey in order to be a good worker. The whiskey would keep them warm in the summer or in the winter, and then in the summer it would keep them strong and keep them going on. And so when Abraham Teachout said to these workers, you're not going to do this with any whiskey, there won't be bottles, there's none of that, you're going to build this steam mill without it, or kindly take yourself home. Well, there wasn't a lot of work going on, and these guys kind of thought about it for a little bit, and they were like, all right, fine, I guess we'll give it a try. Can't say it'll work, but we'll try. Okay, so the steam mill was built by these dry workers. In 1869, he went south to Tennessee to take part in the lumber trade. This is where he ended up making all of his money. In 1873, with the help of his only son, Albert, he established A. Teachout and Company, selling windows, doors, and other building material, as well as some furniture pieces, which, by the way, if you go on eBay, you can look up A. Teachout and Company, and you'll see some of their furniture pieces. For being Victorian style furniture and that long ago, I was surprised that it wasn't actually as expensive as I expected. The business would make Abraham one of the wealthiest men in the 19th century, alongside his best friend, John D. Rockefeller. He and his family were active members in the Franklin Circle Church that we've talked about before. Education was very important to him. He was on the board of directors for Hiram College, where he met his third wife. Now, that wasn't because he got divorced, he just outlived them all. He was 95 years old at his time of passing, so he's going to go through quite a few wives. He gave over $10,000 to Hiram College to build a library with an observatory. The library was still standing until 1995, when a new library had to be built as repairs were just not possible anymore. He was involved heavily with politics and cared deeply for the equal treatment of all people, freeing slaves, and of course, prohibition. He was close friends with and a mentor to James A. Garfield, having both started in the canal boat industry and both being involved heavily with Hiram College. Teachout was an avid poetry writer as well. I did find one poem only. It was titled This Beautiful World. When I read it, it seemed that it talked about the good and the bad within the world and how to make the best of it. And I just want to read you one line because I thought this was really cool. It says, with all its faults, it's a glorious world. It's the only one given to man. So let us accept it with thanks as it is and enjoy it as long as we can. He also wrote a poem that was read at the funeral of James A. Garfield, as well as another one that he dedicated to his mother. Those are the ones that I was not able to find. Like I mentioned, Teachout did outlive two of his three wives. All three are buried here. Awkward. In addition to his family, buried here is also a former slave turned coachman and friend. His name was Mac Henry, and his headstone reads Mac as in M-A-C-K, Henry. In our records, we have it written as Mac Henry. In a lot of the different news stories that came 20, 30, 40 years later, it reads Mac Henry. However, in the initial obituary written when he passed, it is written as Mick Henry, M-C-H-E-N-R-Y. So I was not able to verify his actual name, but that's what I've got. When Abraham did pass away, what I found to be the most unusual is that in his obituary, it didn't mention how his family was grieving or even his friends or anything like that. It actually mentioned the toll that it took on McHenry when he passed. The other unusual thing is, after he passed away, one would assume in that time that McHenry, even though he was almost 80 years old, one would assume that he would have to then leave the home because the man of the house was gone. Staying in the same house as a white woman when you are a former slave and you have no business being there was unheard of. Not even unusual, unheard of. However, Abraham's third wife had said, that's not the way it's going to go. You're going to stay here. This is your home. This is all you know. You're going to stay here until you pass away. And at that time, he wasn't doing well. Like I said, Abraham's death really did a number on him. I just gave myself goosebumps. Anyways, he did end up passing away about 8-9 years later and is buried here. His wife, her name was Mary. This is the third wife, she made sure that the Franklin Avenue house was not sold until after McHenry passed because she knew that no one would sell her a house if they knew that she was bringing him with them. So she waited to sell the house, and they lived in that giant house and couldn't rent out any rooms because, of course, nobody wanted to live there. And so eventually then she went ahead, sold the house, and went and moved into an apartment on Clifton in Lakewood, and then ended up passing away about 4.5 years later from pneumonia. So currently, the Teachout house, like I said, it still stands, offers 5,000 square feet of living space with impressive windows, a unique architectural peak, especially this right here. As you can see, they kind of call that onion-shaped, understandable why. Construction began in 1883 and was completed in 1887. In 1953, it was rezoned from a one-family home to a two-family home, and it also changed from a residential property to a commercial property. Today, it still serves as a duplex and was recently listed for rent in 2022. From what I saw, it did not stay available for rent for very long. It looks like the listing was moved within the same month. And when we went by, there was definitely people living in there, so I think it just got rented very quickly. So that's Abraham Teachout.
This is Mr. George Sherman and his wife Frances Sherman. George Sherman's 4500 Franklin Boulevard home still stands to this day and has been occupied by descendants up until 1992. The Gothic Revival house was built in 1880 by George Sherman. He was the son of Bavarian immigrants and a machinist who worked for many decades at the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company and its successor, the American Shipbuilding Company. There is almost little to no information about George and his wife Frances. I couldn't even find a full obituary on them. It was just a very small death notice when George passed away at 68, and he actually passed away at the home on Franklin Avenue. What I wasn't able to find in my research, however, I think that you can see when you look at the home as it stands today. Since his descendants were the ones who cared for it, you can see that it was very lovingly cared for. It's got beautiful sweeping gables and peaks, and it honestly, it's better taken care of than most of the other homes surrounding it. George and Frances may have lived a simple life. They didn't have any parties or glamorous epitaphs. This is literally all that they have for them. But I think that their legacy and charm can still be seen today when you visit their 4500 Franklin Boulevard home.
We've got Bosworth here. Cyrus Bosworth was a very short, temporary resident of this house right here. 3105 Franklin Boulevard passed through several owners, beginning with a man named Hiram Cook. Cook had the home built in 1853 and only stayed about 10 years before selling it to Mr. and Mrs. Boosfield in 1863. Mr. Boosfield's business collapsed in 1875, causing him to lose everything, including the house. The reason why I bring that up is because they eventually did make it back to Franklin Avenue and bought another home that is referred to as Stone Gables. that is still there, but we don't have the boost fields buried here. I just felt like it was relevant to the home. So having passed through several forfeiture banks, Cyrus Bosworth decided he may as well buy it, see what he can do with it. He was an extremely successful real estate owner, buying and selling property all over Cleveland and Lakewood. He knew the elite status of a home on Franklin Avenue and carried interest without really having to do much to it. He figured he would make this his semi-permanent home while he restored things and got it back to normal, as it was vacant for some time. He knew that he could turn a significant profit, which he did when he sold the home to John Pankhurst, a business partner of Henry Coffinberry and Robert Wallace. Robert Wallace we'll talk about later. Cyrus raised his 3 sons to have similar business practices as himself, including the drive to work hard for what you want. It would seem that Cyrus's grandson, who was named for him, would inherit that same determination even though he never met him. Cyrus Bosworth did pass before he got to meet any of his grandchildren. Cyrus Kurtz, the grandson, who's right there, he invented and produced fully operational cars equipped with automatic transmissions in 1920. Although credit is often given to a Canadian inventor, Kurtz never let that slow him down. He held the patent for several different automobile parts, allowing him to collect royalties on virtually every car that was produced in America. What happened with the original patent for the automatic transmission is that he ran out of money. He didn't come from a lot of money. After Cyrus's passing, the real estate venture stopped, and there was no business to pass down to his sons when it's just real estate, so just buying and selling. And so because of that, by the time Cyrus's grandson came around, they didn't really have a ton of money, but he was smart enough to continue these patents. And like I said, he was looking down the list, and every single car model I could see, he had some sort of a patent that went into that car. So 3105 Franklin, as you can see, still stands today. However, it is in major disrepair and undergoing construction. This construction began in 2021 with the idea that this property would become upscale apartment buildings like one of our other residents that we'll see in a minute. Whether or not construction will continue or finish, it's unknown at this time. There are a lot of permits and I guess tax credit things that they're dealing with that has to do with it being a historical building. It's making construction very difficult. They cannot change the structure of the inside or the outside of the home. They took off a tunnel that went from the house to what would have been like the stables, and it seems like right after that happened, all of a sudden a lot of the construction stopped. I would have to gather that it may have had something to do with removing a tunnel that they maybe shouldn't have done. So for now, it does still sit vacant with a fence around it and all boarded up.
Is it Bosworth the street named after?
It is really very 100% possible.
Okay.
So what we notice is that when some of these people that were, influential, they had these properties, and what they would do is as they would sell off pieces and parts of their properties in different allotments, they would name that street after the person who owned that allotment. So you'll see like Brainerd, Poe, Daisy, all of those are all, if you were to look back at some of those historical maps, you'll see that they owned that area that was right there where now there's a street and it now has their name. Even beyond that a little bit, eventually once they did like the name changes and included like West 14th, that used to be Jennings, things like that. CSU does have a mild recollection of those name changes, and I'm currently working on researching it a little bit more because that is a future tour.
Andrew Jackson Marvin lived happily at the now demolished home on 470 Franklin Avenue. He was born in 1838 in Ashtabula County. Like many of his contemporaries, he was hungry for a new life, education, and the chance to make a name for himself. And he wasn't going to find that on the farm where he was born at. So at the age of 17, he and his 15-year-old brother packed up a wagon and drove through what was at the time barely tamed wilderness to the bustling hub that was to become Cleveland. There he studied law and became a lawyer in 1860. However, when the Civil War broke out, within that year, Andrew was called to work at the commissary department. So he did stuff, food, yeah. When he came back to Cleveland after the war, he was finally able to take up his trade of law and he ended up becoming a very prominent member of the Cleveland Society. His success allowed him to purchase his beautiful Grand Victorian on Franklin Avenue with his wife Emily, and the two spent many years there raising a family and making a life. In addition to his law practice, Andrew was an avid gardener, and his home on Franklin contained many exotic species of flowers and plants. And his love of green spaces didn't end with his own yard. When a park, mentioned earlier, was being proposed for the area around Ohio City, the newspaper reported that at the council planning meetings, Andrew used all of his charisma and vigor that he typically saved for the courtroom and persuaded the city council to not shoot down the park in the planning. The newspaper article in this said that it was a very uproarious, that's the word they used, meeting, so I'm assuming there was a lot of shouting and finger pointing and stuff. We don't hear much about Andrew Marvin again until his death in 1904. It was a really sad story. So at the news that his beloved wife Emily of 44 years was on her own deathbed, when he found out that this was kind of it, he suffered a stroke and ended up passing before her. Emily then, when they came to tell her that same day, was so shocked about hearing about her husband's sudden death that she passed within that hour. Today, the Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry building sits where Andrew's lively home once stood. And while looking at it, you really can't help but wonder if the parking lot once housed his rare plants and flowers, and if the current building still holds his boisterous spirit and boundless need to do good.
J.J. Cartwright was in business with a man named F.W. Bell, and together they owned Bell, Cartwright and Company, which was a lumber mill. They sold doors, furniture, window frames, other items similar to Abraham Teachout. They managed this business pretty well together from 1871 until 1893, when suddenly their lumber business took a nosedive. I was not able to figure out why that happened, but what I did see is that they borrowed $50,000 from one bank. They borrowed $80,000 from another bank, keeping in mind this is the late 1800s.
A couple million.
They did this with the hope that the following year they would do much better. They would improve their sales, they would make up for the terrible year that they had, but unfortunately that did not happen. And rather than just being about $130,000 in debt, they were $216,079 in debt. Their assets that they could sell off were only about $215,000, and a judge eventually did order Bell and Cartwright to sell off every piece and part of their business in order to pay back these creditors. That meant that it was the end of that lumber company. That is similar to the previous one. After that, we don't hear anything else about Cartwright. It's next to impossible to find anything. I've actually been looking up information about Cartwright since I started, when I did a mausoleum style type thing and I was trying to find information about nothing. Even as I've learned more about researching, still nothing. So what we see here though is that his home is no longer standing. It was knocked down in the early 1920s, and the land was sold to the Freemasons for the purpose of building their temple. Charles Hopkinson, son of A.G. Hopkinson, who we will see near the end. Charles Hopkinson is also the architect for our Riverside office as well. He built this, or designed this temple, put the plan together, adopted by the lodge, and then the temple is nearly 42,000 square feet, and the completion was in 1932. Now it is home to a company called Cleveland Rocks. It's a rock climbing facility. They also have within the building smaller studios for yoga and other things that, keep you healthy and moving, fitness, that sort of thing. This picture was taken recently, so as you can see, the Masonic symbol is still up there on the top, but no longer used by the Masons at all. So we have Robert Mason Wallace at 4724 Franklin. He was born in Ireland in 1834, came to Cleveland in 1854 to connect with his uncle, Robert Sanderson. Robert Sanderson was the principal owner of Globe Iron Works. Robert Wallace began work as a machinist within Globe Iron Works and worked his way to being an engineer. By 1866, Wallace and a partner of his, John Pankhurst, the one that Cyrus Bosworth sold the house to, began a small machine shop. The following year, Wallace developed a portable steam engine that was used to unload cargo from these Great Lakes ships. This dramatically improved the unloading process and proved to be extremely profitable for the little machine shop. The men then added Henry Coffinberry to their partnership, and within just a few short years, they accumulated enough capital to then purchase a controlling interest in Globe Iron Works. Prior to Wallace taking over Globe Iron Works, the company only supplied parts to shipbuilding companies. However, Wallace saw an opportunity with their ever-growing business. In 1876, the business partners purchased a dock nearby, changed the business name from Globe Iron Works to Globe Shipbuilding, and began building these ships. This was another extremely powerful move, because up until Robert Wallace, Great Lakes ships required the coordination of several different companies to manufacture each part from start to finish. What they did was combine it all into one business, one-stop shop. In 1882, Wallace built and launched the very first large iron commercial ship to sail in the Great Lakes. Robert Wallace's fortunes grew quickly, which gave him and Mrs. Wallace the idea that it was time to leave their modest house in Lakewood and move to a home built just for them on Franklin Avenue, where they became neighbors to the Hopkinson family. Wallace's interests weren't strictly in shipbuilding. He was an active member of the church and was also an active member of the Masonic fraternity. He was most active with the Royal Arch Masonic Lodge and a 32nd degree Mason. There was a Royal Arch Masonic Lodge named for him at one point until they merged with a chapter in Berea. One of my favorite things to do when I'm researching is I type these people's name into eBay to see if I can find any of their stuff, and then I buy it. Coming to me in 3 days is a Masonic coin that I found on eBay that has Robert M. Wallace's name on it with the Masonic Royal Arch Mason symbol on it. Weird thing, I know. Wallace Manor was built around 1883 in the Queen Anne style, and of course, the architect on this was Charles Hopkinson. This house was designed to be a single-family home. However, today it is used as a bed and breakfast. This house, as well as the structure that is behind it that you can't see in that picture, did become home to many different families before it turned into the bed and breakfast. That would have been in 1997, and the new owners spent 17 years painstakingly restoring this home. It was said in several different articles that the people who purchased that, their idea was they wanted to stick as true to the Queen Anne style architecture as possible and do things as close to how they would have been done originally. Taking a look inside, you can see that they definitely put their heart and soul into that. And from what I understand, it is available that you can book yourself a bed and breakfast right there at the Wallace Manor.
Not really much is known about Louis Day and his beautiful home that he inhabited on Franklin Avenue with his wife Adeline. He lived and died between 1839 and 1899. We know that he was a sergeant in the Union Army and that he also moved up in the ranks and was discharged as a lieutenant. He is best known as the superintendent of the early Cleveland and Canton school system. I could not find a single obituary on him. He was actually, the only piece of information I could find about Louis Day was that he was in a scandal. The way that this article was written, it was very difficult to decipher exactly what the problem was, because like she mentioned earlier, there's a lot of typos. The way they structured sentences back then is a lot different than how we do today, but this is what I gleaned from it. He was accused of accepting a bribe from a rail line company when he and his fellow administrators were traveling out west for a teaching conference. The railway company, CCC, was trying to obtain as many tickets sold to this expensive trip out to San Francisco. and they needed people to purchase it from them, not any other rail line company. Initially, Mr. Day and his colleagues were not going to go, and this would have been 30 missing seats that could easily have been sold. So in order to coerce Day and his administrators to buy from their rail line, they provided him with a free first-class ticket all the way from Cleveland to San Francisco, in exchange for requiring his other educators to attend the meeting and purchase their tickets with the rail company. This was a big, it had something to do with the Transportation Administration because they were bribing an educator. So he was in the paper about it. There was a huge court case, and I could not find a single thing about how it ended. Today, if you visit Louis Day's home, you'll have to swing by the Ohio City Deli convenience store, pop in, and maybe try your luck with a lottery ticket, grab a cold beverage, and remember Louis Day and his house that lays beneath the parking lot. Robert Russell Rhodes' Italianate mansion sits at the northern end of Franklin Boulevard today, like a ruby jewel in a monarch's crown. The massive stone columns rise up, and you can kind of feel the power and purpose still radiating from its structure. What is now a series of apartments was once the palatial home of one of Cleveland's most wealthy and well-known residents. Robert Rhodes was born in 1845 to his parents Daniel and Sophia, followed by his brother, the famous James Ford Rhodes, who the high school is named after. His father, already a very successful businessman and political figure in the city, expected big things from his two sons. Daniel turned out to be a bit of a jack of all trades and was absolutely a master of all of them. When he was 21, he served in the Union Army as a non-commissioned officer for the Ohio National Guard. Once the war ended, he threw himself into creating the best life possible for himself and his new wife, Kate. As mentioned earlier, Robert had several businesses and was somehow able to keep all of them running like clockwork at the same time. He was involved in the Southern Railroad Company, the People's Savings Bank, the New York, the Pennsylvania, and Ohio Railroad Companies, and the Great Lakes Towing Company. With the success of all his pursuits, Robert decided to build his majestic mansion at 2905 Franklin Boulevard. He and his wife Kate gave the house its stunning character, and to this day it still feels very lively and proud. They both had several children there, but only two lived to adulthood. A girl named Fanny, who died at the age of 28, and William, who passed on in 1914, 2 years before his father. The easiest way to explain the character of Robert Russell Rhodes is to tell you about what happened after his death. His wife passed away in 1907, and as mentioned before, his son William died 2 years before he did. He had no really close family to leave any of his estate to, and his will instructed that his $2.25 million estate, now this is in the money of 1919, okay, should be gifted to all hospitals, elderly homes, orphanages, sanatoriums, and other public health programs throughout the city of Cleveland. In today's money, that $2.25 million would be the equivalent of $42 million. That's a big one. Russell Rhodes isn't just settled in its ruby red stones. It lives on in so many organizations and the descendants helped by the gift of his estate. For now, the only tangible memory we have of him is the ornate trimmings and soaring center tower of 2905 Franklin Boulevard, a silent sentinel for the other homes that exist on its tree-lined street. William J. Roberts. The first thing that I read when I was looking up stuff on William J. Roberts was the fabulous parties and weddings that were hosted in his Franklin Avenue home. He and another well-known prominent family, the Brainards, would throw balls, card parties, and other lavish events, and they were so over the top that they were always mentioned in the society paper. Back then, they would talk about the parties and what the food was, what the decorations were, what the mood of the evening was, what the people were wearing. Everything from decorations down to the outfits that Mrs. Teresa Roberts, his wife, were described in juicy detail so that everyone who wasn't lucky enough to attend could drool and dream over the possibility of getting invited to one of the parties thrown at William J. Roberts' 5005 Franklin Avenue home. Just who was William J. Roberts and his wife Teresa? W.J., as he liked to be known, came to Cleveland in the mid-19th century and established himself in the industrial boom that happened along the shores of Lake Erie. W.J., wanting to have a piece of that prosperity that was going on, teamed up with two other men, Samuel Gibson and Fred Beckwith. Together they started the Gibson, Roberts, and Beckwith Lead Works. Their original operation sat on what was then Champion Street and what is now where Terminal Tower stands. They grew out of that space and eventually built a warehouse in the flats. As far as I could tell, the warehouse does not exist anymore, but again, the maps then were kind of weird looking. The company outlived its owners well into the 20th century, and it evolved into what is now the United Lead Company. As W.J. got older and more prominent in the area, he eventually left the lead company and became the bank president of the Brooklyn Savings and Loan Association. The grand house on Franklin Avenue showed off every bit of William J. Roberts' wealth and prosperity. I couldn't find much about his wife Teresa before she married W.J., but it was she who bought the house with her own money. Even over 150 years later, the home is still absolutely stunning. Many of the original finishes and features have been preserved, and you can actually purchase the house now for a cool $625,000. According to a family story, the Roberts were so in love with their home that when they reluctantly placed the home up for sale because they wanted to move into a bigger and grander house, they were so heartbroken about it that they actually rebought the house back at the asking price because they loved it so much. They lived there for another 40 years until W.J.'s death. If you drive by the home now, you can easily imagine a card party being held one muggy summer evening. The garden and sunroom full of ladies and gentlemen dressed in their Victorian finery. Someone playing Debussy on the piano by gas lamp and candlelight. The sound of it drowned out only by the joyful laughter and tinkling of crystal glasses. I hope whoever takes ownership of W.J.'s and Teresa's home at 5005 Franklin Avenue will love it as much as they did. So I hope you visit it. It's absolutely beautiful.
Grave of Stephen Buhrer. He has 4606 Franklin Boulevard. Stephen was born on Christmas Day in 1825 on a farm in Ohio, and his father passed when he was just 4 years old. His mother, who decided she couldn't handle it, sent him off to live on a communal farm at the age of 4. He picked up tricks of the trade of copper and decided to get into the copper industry for just a bit. At the age of 19, he came to Cleveland, but had difficulty doing typical jobs as he was very weak and very sick. It wasn't until he was around 30 years old that he started to maintain his health and understand what his triggers were. Eventually, Buhrer started his own business with the hope that he could handle it despite his health. He set up shop next door to a commission house on the Old Canal. John D. Rockefeller was a clerk at that commission house next door, so he and Buhrer became great friends. It was reported that whenever Rockefeller would return to Cleveland, Buhrer was the first hand he shook. Stephen was a mayor of Cleveland for 2 terms, serving 1867 through 1871. During his time in office, he advocated for the establishment of city farms so that orphans had something to eat. Knowing his background and knowing that he was abandoned at 4 years old, that makes sense. The city did purchase 2 farms on the south side. However, the plan never went through. One of the farms was then used as a cemetery. Don't ask me which one, I didn't look into it. I don't know. Buhrer signed the first official recommendation for the Superior Viaduct. In 1869, Buhrer, his wife, and 3 children moved into the house on Franklin Avenue. Buhrer and his first wife and second wife lived there until they each passed. In 1914, when the second wife passed, the home was inherited by her brother, although it appeared that the social status that one might gain
by living on Franklin Boulevard was starting to dwindle, and so her brother really didn't want anything to do with the house. People at this time were opting to move further out into Fairview, West Park, Lakewood. His second wife, Marguerite Patterson, it was her brother Abraham who had taken over. Now, he did remodel the house before he sold it. He turned it into a multi-family home, and over the years would remodel and renovate as needed. This house is a Second Empire-style house designed by the architect firm of Grease and Weil. The size of the home indicated that he wanted to be left alone and used this house as a place of relaxation. This house is still standing today and still serves as a multi-family home. Most of these mansionettes, as they were called, were turned into multi-family homes just because it wasn't ideal to have a big giant home as we kind of inched further and further into that Great Depression. Things like a big house like that was just not something that you wanted to invest your time or money in. And so, like I said, that one is still standing and still has 2 renters, if I'm not mistaken.
Lanson Granville Hopkinson's house is no more. It was torn down about, we think like about 100 years ago, give or take. And there's nothing there but a vacant lot now, which is super sad when you learn about him. The house of Lanson Granville Hopkinson is now an empty, overgrown lot, torn down about 100 years ago. No pictures of it remain, no blueprints or mentions of it can be found anywhere. The thing that I found sad about this is that Lanson was probably one of the most influential residents of the west side of Cleveland in his day. But with his home gone, there's really nothing but this headstone to remember him by. And once I tell you the story, you will see what an absolute shame that is. So in researching Lanson, one thing that moved me about him was that he was so beloved that it was hard to choose an obituary because there were several written about him to focus on. He had about 4 obituaries written about him. He was born in Massachusetts in 1823. He studied education at Dartmouth College, and in 1852 he settled in his beautiful home on 343 Franklin Avenue in Cleveland. Immediately he set to work teaching A grade, or what we would know today as primary and middle school. While also serving on the city council, Lanson noticed that there was no established high school for students on the west side of Cleveland to continue their education. The only means for them to obtain that next level of schooling was for them to either travel daily to the high school that was on the east side, or their parents had to afford to send them to stay in that area and house them. This lack of access and roadblocks to the youth of the west side made him determined to establish a high school there. He faced a lot of opposition from the city council, the majority of whom were from the east side, because they wanted to keep the money and the tax dollars going into the east side. They justified this by saying that his students were not bright enough and weren't worthy enough to have a school built for them. So he basically put them to the test, and he said, "I'll wager with you that if you test my students, you will find that they are just as bright and just as capable as any other student you have ever come across." They did school them. They did bring the students in, and they gave them a very vigorous test. It was very pointed questions. They were trying to trip them up. But his students passed with flying colors. And Lanson Hopkinson was made principal of the high school that was eventually built. He served for many years and was really beloved by the faculty and students for his kindness, wisdom, and belief in him. He retired from the school, and then he briefly went into the insurance business as an underwriter. But his health was declining, and he was forced to quit. He lived out the rest of his life at his Franklin Avenue home with his wife Harriet and their only 2 surviving sons, Harry and Charles, who we've been talking about. In 1896, his battle with, it was called neuralgia, which it kind of ranges from shingles to diabetes. I'm not really sure. We don't really have a modern equivalent to that name. Came to an end, and he died peacefully. The whole of the west side went into mourning, and the city council and the school that he was principal of and helped build held their own memorial services for him. But it was his fellow underwriters who wrote about his memory in a way that I feel sums up this great man that we never knew of. I'm just going to read you a couple of excerpts from his obituary because they say it a lot better than I could say it. His voice was never silent when it could be used to defend or maintain the purity of this association, and his heart beat with a tenderness for its weaker members that would not rest or stop short of equal justice to all. Man lives not to himself alone, and the good that men do lives after them. We honor his life of uprightness and fidelity to every trust as presiding officer, in important committee work, and in the wider field fraught with importance amongst beyond comprehension. On the floor of this chamber, his counsel and wisdom found voice from a heart as pure as ever beat in the breast of man. In debate, his convictions were always well grounded. He was supremely above and beyond all petty contentions. It is our good privilege to remember him as our trusted associate and as the best of men. So I thought that was really beautiful.
I will hand our last stop of the tour over to Bill.
Thanks. Okay, so when people hear the name Hannes Tiedemann, it sends a shiver up their spine, right? You think haunted houses and all that. The man that was responsible for building the Franklin Castle, he did have a very colorful life. I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. He was born April 12, 1832 in a small village called Suderau, Schleswig-Holstein region of what was then Prussia, now Germany, of course. In 1848, his father, having passed away about a year and a half earlier, and war looming on the horizon in Prussia, he was only 16 years old at the time, with his widowed mother. Her name was Wiebke Mohr Tiedemann. His two older brothers, Klaus, who Tiedemann Road is named for, and Ludwig, who Tiedemann Avenue in Defiance is named for, and his sisters Katharina, Eliza, and Louisa. The seven of them came aboard a ship called the Danish Brig Manor and arrived in New York in May of 1848. Now, they were originally bound for Wisconsin, but they only made it as far as Cleveland. See, there was a fellow traveling on the same vessel as them named Henning Bolton, and romance must have fallen between him and Katharina because when they arrived in Cleveland, they got married here. Yeah, and then sadly, just about a week or two later, Henning Bolton passed away. He'd been traveling for his health. He was in a low state. Turns out that he had pulmonary tuberculosis consumption. Passed away, left everything to his now widow, Katharina, who passed that money to her mother, who purchased a very sizable farm and sold that to the eldest of the children to establish a family home, and that is now Lindale. But it was the original Tiedemann farm. Later on, Klaus would move down the road. Though he took a job working as a cooper's apprentice, making barrels, southern end of Parma on State Road. But by the early 1850s, had came back to Cleveland and worked as a traveling salesman for a grocery firm, Babcock and Hurd. During that time, he befriended a fellow named John Christian Weidman, who worked for a rival grocery firm, Edwards and Idings, and the two, by the early 1860s, formed their own grocery firm, Weidman Tiedemann. Hannes Tiedemann would build the bulk of his fortune in that grocery firm, but by the early 1870s, he sold his interests and retired, going into private capitalism, purchasing properties around Cleveland. That firm, by the way, stayed the Weidman Company all the way through the 1950s. It's still around today, only you know it as Sara Lee Foods. There's the connection. In the early 1880s, though, after having spent about 2 or 3 years with his family living in Germany, he returned, having amassed quite a bit of wealth, and it was at that time that he had started construction on a house over in Lakewood, Summer Estate. Previously, and during this whole time, he and his wife, Louise Tiedemann, whom he went back to Germany and married in the early 1860s, had purchased in 1865 a 2-story wooden house on Franklin. It was occupied by them till about 1881. At that time, the house in Lakewood was finished. The plan was, move out to Lakewood, tear down this old house, and let's build a new house here. One of the reasons also that they had traveled to Germany was their eldest daughter, Emma, was in poor health. She suffered from diabetes, and it was believed that they had these curative baths over in Germany that could cure diabetes. Obviously, that wasn't the case. They came back, their daughter was in failing health, and in January of 1881, Emma passed away. She was only 15 years old. Originally, they had her remains kept for a few months over in the vault below the chapel. Nothing weird about that. It was wintertime, ground was frozen. You couldn't dig graves in frozen ground. They were all dug by hand back then. Sadly, within a couple of months, her grandmother, Vika, passed away also, but not in the house called the Franklin Castle, as legend says. She died over on West 47th Street. Also, the castle wasn't built yet. That old house was still standing. Ultimately, they were laid to rest here. The Franklin Castle, as we know, was built between 1881 and 1883, while the family was residing over at their house in Lakewood. I'll get into details about the castle towards the end of this as I'm wrapping up. They moved back into the castle. Having established a family burial plot over here at Riverside, Mr. Tiedemann was also on the board at the time. He had 3 children. He and Louise had 3 children that had previously died in infancy between 1863 and 1873. They were originally buried over at Riverside Cemetery. Now, if you read up on the legend of the castle, you'll see 3 children mysteriously died in the summer of 1883, all very close to each other. That's not true. What really happened was, in 1883, Hannes and Louise Tiedemann had their 3 infant children's remains exhumed and moved here and buried right here behind the monument underneath that little stone planter that's over there. You may also notice that there's a stone by itself here that says Ludwig on it. Ludwig was a distant cousin of Hannes Tiedemann's, lived in his home village, Suderau, had come to Cleveland, didn't even tell Hannes and Louise that he was coming. He was staying with a friend over on downtown side, and during that winter of 1885 to 86, he went out and got lost in a snowstorm. When they found him, he had frostbite so severe that they had to amputate his legs at the knees. And he was over here at City Hospital, which is today Metro. About 6 months later, he contracted meningitis while at the hospital, and he passed away from that. And it was then that Hannes Tiedemann found out that his cousin was here in the United States and in Cleveland. He had no idea. So he wrote a letter back home, and he said, "Don't worry, I'm taking care of him," and he buried him here also. The family continued to live at the Franklin Castle, which never was really called that until the 1960s. It was always just known as the Tiedemann House. Until the mid-1890s, in March of 1895, Louise Tiedemann passed away, was laid to rest here. A year later, Hannes Tiedemann had gone back to Germany, and he found a second wife, 25 years his junior. There's a big age difference between the two of them. Henriette Kepke. She came back, and within a year, she really enjoyed spending time out at that house in Lakewood. And he didn't really see any need to keep the house in Cleveland. He was now a bank executive, president of the United Banking and Savings Company, which is still around today, but through a number of mergers is now Key Bank. He could just ride the trolley from the house out in Lakewood and be in Cleveland in just a few minutes. So he sold the house in Cleveland on Franklin, moved out to Lakewood, and spent the rest of his days there, and it was there that he passed away in January of 1908. Not while walking through a park from a massive stroke, struck down by the hand of God, as you might read. According to his obituary, none of his obituaries actually say that. He died at home at 3 p.m, surrounded by his friends. He had only been sick for a few days. Died from arteriosclerosis, and was laid to rest here. This is where his daughter Emma, his mother is back there, his wife. And then we have these folks right here in the front. These are his Tiedemann's grandsons, Herbert and Carl. His son August's wife, Ella Rao Tiedemann. She was the daughter of Charles Rao, who's buried back over there, the automaker. And then her second husband, John Teft Clark. Now, as far as the castle goes, after they moved out, it was sold to a brewer. As the story says, it wasn't actually a brewer. It was the widow of a brewer. Her name, Louise Strangman Mulhauser, and she had the house till about 1915. It was then owned by a Dr. Schurke for only about 6 years, and then it was owned by the German Singing Society, Bildungsverein Eintracht. And they had it till about 1967, at which time it was sold to the Romano family, and that's when the ghost stories emerged. I'm going to get into those because I'm sure you know all the ghost stories. That's really from there, it just keeps changing hands every few owners, all the way up to the present, where it's owned by an LLC called Oh Dear Productions, and it's now open to the public for overnight stays and whatnot. A lot of people don't realize this, though, that not only did Hannes and Louise Tiedemann have a daughter named Emma and a son named August, but they also had a daughter named Dora. Poor Dora has always been left out of the story. Dora ended up marrying a fellow named Edward Johannes Louis Wiebenson. Ed Wiebenson's father and Jacob Wiebenson and Hannes Tiedemann were friends. So when the Wiebenson family moved to Iowa from Germany, Jacob Wiebenson and Hannes Tiedemann stayed friends, and then Jacob says, well, I'm sending my son Ed to come to Cleveland, teach him the banking trade, show him something. So Ed Wiebenson came to Cleveland and fell head over heels in love with Tiedemann's youngest daughter, and they ended up getting married eventually. Tragically, like her sister, she also had diabetes, and she died quite suddenly in 1906, and she was only 35 years old. While she was in Germany getting treatment or seeking treatment for her diabetic condition, she was attending a performance at a theater, and she tripped over her dress walking down the stairs, fell, fractured a hip, and she died from an infection 2 days later. That was 1906. Her and her husband had 4 sons at the time. Tragically, 4 years later, Ed Wiebenson also died. He was only 50. He had appendicitis. They removed the appendix, but then pneumonia set in, and he died quite suddenly from that. And they are both buried right over here, so just a few feet to the north of Hannes and Louise Tiedemann. So that is the story of the Franklin Castle, Hannes and Louise Tiedemann. And I like sharing this story because I did have the privilege of living in the house for 6 years. I moved out in December, but the bedroom that I occupied was what they called historically the cold room, because it was about 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. I could never figure it out. That was also the room that Louise Tiedemann passed away in 1895. That was her bedroom. I did a lot of times sleeping on the couch. So thank you. I'm going to hand this back over to you. Hold on. Yeah.
Halfway through your book on the Franklin Castle. Really, really good.
Oh, thank you. 2 most popular questions I get asked commonly is how do you say your last name? Because I see it and it's like Krajecki. Anyway, no, it's not Krajecki. The other question is the Franklin Castle really haunted? And I have to say I never deal in absolutes. I never do. I moved in 2016 and I was a total skeptic, and I said, well, I'd never seen a ghost, and I moved out in December. Yeah, it's haunted.
Gotcha.
I had a number of personal. I was keeping a journal while I was there, and it was a handbook for the recently deceased from Beetlejuice, and it's just a notebook, and so I was keeping a log of all the paranormal activity.
That's kind of cool, though.
Stuff that I could have, and it's patchy, but I just date, time, what happened, and
It's interesting. Yeah.
so.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So I was sleeping on the couch and heard somebody running up the stairs, and I thought at the time the house was being worked on, I thought it was one of the carpenter's sons, Isaiah Detweiler, and he's 15 at the time. And I sit up, and I'm like, oh, it's still dark, and I'm like, okay. And then about a minute or 2 later, I hear boom, 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 running back down, and the little kid giggling, and I thought Freeman had brought his whole family with him. He's got like 6 kids, a big Amish family. Sometimes they would come in, his wife would do some sewing for the owner. So I get up, and I go out into the hallway, I open the door, walk out into the hall, and I just ask them, hey, can you just, yes, kids, keep it down, I'm still sleeping. And I come out, and the light turns on automatically on its own. That's normal, it's on a motion sensor, nothing paranormal about that. But then I realize that the whole house is dark, and I look down the stairwell, and there's nobody there, and I check the front, there's nobody. And I go in, I turn on the light in my living room, and I look at my clock, and it's only about 4:30 in the morning. Oh. And these guys don't show up for another 3 hours. So I'm like, okay, that's it. Turn on the TV, watch some ABC Rules Now, get the coffee going. So yeah, that's one